The title of this video is A Union of States or an Empire. And the key question here is this: should the United States of America be a union of states or an empire? I think you know what we have today. Let's kind of look at the history a little bit. When the 13 colonies revolted against Great Britain for, I guess you could say, questionable reasons, that's another story, but they joined together to fight the British. Okay, we're not going to look at whether that was a legitimate reason, you know, whether there are reasons to go to war with Great Britain and secede when the 13 colonies fought to secede from Great Britain, whether that was legitimate or not. But the fact is they did fight to break away, and they had help from France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And in 1783, the British signed a treaty saying the Peace of Paris, saying, okay, fine, hell, go break away, the Treaty of Paris. And the 13 colonies had a union of states, which was ratified in 1781, called the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation. We don't know if it was going to really work, because after only 6 years, people said, okay, it's not working, so let's hurry up and have a meeting where we're going to ostensibly correct some of the problems with the articles. But they decided in this secret meeting, no, you know what, we're going to just we're going to write a new constitution. A lot of sirens out here. Okay, so they wrote a new constitution, making a stronger union of states. The Constitution, we call it the Constitution. And they sent it out to the states, and there was a bunch of arguments. There were a bunch of arguments. The anti-federalists saying, no, you're creating an empire, a centralized government. It's going to take away people's rights, Thomas Jefferson and people like that. It's going to violate people's rights. It's going to be this big empire. And the Federalists say, no, 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 it won't be. And actually, you can get the Federalist Papers. I have that. Should have brought it here as a prop for the video. But anyway, the states did ratify it in 1788. It was adopted, and they adopted the second Constitution, which we just call the Constitution. And they put in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, which were supposed to clarify the relationship between the U.S. government, what it could do, and the states, and what they could do. And the 10th Amendment saying all powers not delegated to the U.S. government are reserved to the states or the people. Now, a Federalist, you know, the Federalist Papers are very interesting. Nobody really reads those. And I don't know how deeply those are taught in constitutional law classes. Because I know lawyers. I have a good friend who's a lawyer. He said basically all they learn in law school is case law. They don't really learn about the Constitution. Just what did this ruling say? What did that ruling say? Okay. In the Federalist Papers written by, these are a series of articles in the newspaper promoting the Constitution, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, they were saying this: look, the Bill of Rights is dangerous because you're saying, for instance, the First Amendment, Congress shall pass no law abridging the freedom of speech. Alexander Hamilton said the problem with that is that you're implying that they somehow have this power, where there's nothing in the Constitution when you read it. Nowhere does it say Congress can abridge the freedom of speech. So he's saying what you're doing is you're implying that they already have this power, and you're saying no, they can't abridge the freedom of speech, or they can't take away your right to bear arms, or whatever. So he said that's a dangerous thing. You're giving them powers that they don't have anyway. But the anti-federalists said, no, no, we have to clarify this. So they adopted the Bill of Rights, 10th Amendment, all powers not delegated to the U.S. government is reserved to the states and the people. Well, that's what Alexander Hamilton was saying. That is already the case. You're stating what is already the case. So you're implying that somehow they have these powers. But anyway, there was an uneasy compromise to some extent, but they decided we will have a centralized government which will exercise certain delegated powers, and all the other powers will rest with the states. Fine. So from 1781, when they adopted the Articles of Confederation, really, let's say 1776, when they declared their independence, up until 1860, when they had the Second Revolution, the states enjoyed a very large amount of autonomy, independence. You know, you never had these arguments about, can a state have homosexual marriage or not? Of course, you never had an argument like that because, first of all, that was never a topic that was even dreamed of at the time. But secondly, they would have never had the argument because everybody knew, obviously, it's a state power. There's nothing in the Constitution that says Congress can tell states who may or may not be married within the state. I mean, there was no question about it. Even the slavery issue, no one ever said, well, constitutionally, Congress can tell a state they have to outlaw slavery. Well, of course they would never entertain that argument because there was no power. The U.S. government had no power to do such a thing. But here's the but part. The Republican Party was formed in the 1850s from sort of a conglomeration of Southern Whigs and Northern Whigs. The Whig Party was the old nationalist party. They wanted more federal power and high tariffs to prevent foreign competition to U.S. manufacturers and all of that. But the Whig Party got in a fight over slavery. The Southern Whigs wanted it to expand to the West. The Northern Whigs didn't, and they broke apart. And then they had abolitionists that didn't really have a party. They wanted to sort of like violate the early 1788 Constitution, and they wanted to push for the outlaw of slavery. And they had other moderate groups that were anti-slavery in the sense that they didn't want it spreading out west. They wanted it to be contained in the South. Okay. In the southern states, the Old South, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, down to the bottom, Texas and Florida, all to the bottom. They looked on the Republican Party as with dread. They said, this is terrible because the Republican Party they considered it a radical party, and it was going to, they didn't know what it was going to do. They just thought it was going to do crazy things if it came into power, and the original compromise of 1787 and 88 would be violated. And they were going to set up this centralized government and all of this. So the southern states, starting with South Carolina in 1860, said, you know what, we have to get out now. We have to get out now because what they argued about in 1787 is happening now. All the fears are happening now. They're going to violate our rights. They're going to have this revolutionary party in power, and they're going to spread this radicalism, and we have to get out now. So just like our forefathers seceded from Great Britain in 1776, we're going to secede. And what South Carolina's argument was this: in 1788, we signed, or we ratified the Constitution. In other words, South Carolina said, we agreed in 1788 to form a union with the other states. And we called it the United States of America. But we have decided we don't want to be part of that union anymore. We voluntarily joined the union, so now we're going to voluntarily withdraw from the union and dissolve the union, which they did. And the precedent was there, obviously. You secede from Great Britain, you voluntarily join the other states, and now you leave. Some people say, no, the Articles of Confederation talked about a perpetual union. That's true, but then the Articles of Confederation was very quickly thrown out the window, so they must have not believed it was too perpetual. They didn't even keep the original document. And then a domino effect, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Georgia also withdrew. And they decided to form their own union, a loose confederation of states called the Confederate States of America, much like the original Articles of Confederation. We know the war broke out. Other states, when Lincoln ordered an invasion force to be formed, 75,000 troops to invade the South, very quickly, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, who would never dream or could never allow themselves to fight against fellow Southern states, and it would be against their honor to allow invasion troops to march through their states to invade fellow states. They felt that they were honor bound to withdraw and join the Confederacy. And so a new country was formed. Here's the last, you've seen this, this was the final flag of the Confederacy. This flag was adopted in 1865. Of course, the South was weak, and it was defeated after 4 years. I mean to say it was relatively weak relative to the U.S. government, U.S. Military. So the Confederate states were invaded and defeated. And the U.S. and what they feared came into play, because the Republican Party started to pass, and the radical faction of the Republican Party after Lincoln was killed took over. And one of the first things, well, they passed the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery in all the states. Okay. The thing that caused, there wasn't a big uproar against that, because the Confederates knew if they lost the war, that was going to be the end of slavery. But the thing that caused the huge uproar was the 14th Amendment. They said, now we're going to pass the 14th Amendment. The Southerners said, this is insane. They couldn't allow this, because the 14th Amendment was basically, in their view, setting up an empire, a centralized dictatorship of Congress. And if you read the 14th Amendment, you can see why they thought this. And they rejected the 14th Amendment. They would not ratify it. They just said, we're not ratifying it. So it couldn't pass. Could not pass. So the U.S. sort of like reinvaded the Confederate states, the former Confederacy, by saying, okay, you know what, by the way, we're going to pass a law saying you're not states, actually. You're military districts. And they sent the U.S. Army to occupy all the military districts. And they said, you cannot become a state again until you ratify the 14th Amendment, right? A treaty, talked about that in that last video, when Napoleon forced other countries to be his allies. A treaty with a gun to your head is not really a valid treaty, because you're being forced under duress to sign a treaty. An amendment, constitutional amendment, is really a treaty between states. Well, that was the original idea of it. Okay, because you're changing the original compact of 1788. So they said, if you don't ratify it, you can't become a state again if you don't ratify it. So then Tennessee ratified it. They said, okay, we want to be a state. So they ratified it early on, 1868, and they were allowed back in. Some states like Louisiana and Mississippi never would ratify it. They just wouldn't ratify it. So they stayed under military occupation until 1878, when they had worked out a deal with the Republican President Hayes, who was more moderate, Rutherford B. Hayes, because of an election crisis that cropped up in 1876. So they kind of decided, the moderate Republicans and the Democratic Party decided, let's forget all this endless occupation of the South and all this rigmarole. We'll just call it off. And so they had lost their enthusiasm for civil rights and everything after 13 years. So the South was more or less allowed to go back and to sort of like have a counter-revolution in a way. And by the year 1895, the Southern Democrats, the Bourbon Democrats, they called them, in homage to the Bourbons in France, who wanted to set up a reactionary government, set up reactionary governments. Okay. Now, some people went to court and said you can't violate people's civil rights based on the 14th Amendment. Now let's look at the 14th Amendment. I have it brought up on the computer here, called up on the computer. This was the thing that really upset people. First of all, it says, Section 1, all persons born or naturalized in the United States. And now this is important for the liberal factions today that say all illegal alien children that are born in America are automatically citizens. But if you read the Constitution's 14th Amendment, you can see that's obviously not the case, because it says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So what the liberal groups say is, if an illegal alien comes in from Mexico and she has a baby, the baby is automatically a citizen. That is not true, because the baby is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. The baby is subject to the jurisdiction of Mexico. The baby's a Mexican citizen. The mother brought the baby here, and then she gave birth to the baby. Just like if a person was on a trip from France, let's say tourists came to Disney World, and the woman had a baby, a French tourist had a baby at Disney World, no one would consider the baby a U.S. citizen. They would say, obviously, as a French, the woman just happened to have a baby while she was here. Or if the Hungarian ambassador and his wife were residing in D.C. and the wife had a baby, no one would consider the baby all of a sudden an American citizen. Everyone could see quite clearly the baby was a Hungarian, just happened to be born in America. So only a person who either is ignorant of the Constitution, which most Americans tend to be, or is trying to twist the Constitution their way would cite this amendment to justify illegal alien babies becoming automatically U.S. citizens. But we're not going to get into that, because that's a child could figure that out. Here's the problem that causes the controversy. The second sentence of Section 1. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean when it says no state shall make or enforce any law? Any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. You say, what privileges and immunities? Hey, that's what everybody was trying to figure out in 1866. The southern states said, this is lawyer speak. Equal protection of the law. What does that mean? Well, you tell me. Well, we know today what the situation is, because now we have this enabling act, the 14th Amendment, which was adopted through the use of force. But then you have states like Mississippi later on in the 1990s, could have been the 80s, but I believe the 90s. They wanted to appear politically correct. So Mississippi says, we're going to ratify the 14th Amendment to show you we're not whatever. It's, you know, that kind of stuff is, it's like the Baptist Church apologizing for slavery. I don't think any Baptists ever owned slaves. I'm talking about Baptists that are alive now or were alive in 1996 when the Southern Baptists apologized for slavery. I don't think any of them owned slavery. That would be like me apologizing for some of the mass killings during the French Revolution because some of my ancestors came from France. I can't apologize for that because I had nothing to do with it. So when you apologize for things you didn't do, it's A, stupid, and B, what it is you trying to say, look how wonderful I am. Look at me. I'm apologizing for things I didn't do. Aren't I wonderful and politically correct? But some people can see behind all that, or you know, they can see how ridiculous that is. But now let's go back to the empire or the Union of States. So what we have the 14th Amendment, which says Congress is going to pass all these laws, and they're in control now, and no state can violate people's privileges or immunities. What are these? Well, Homer Plessy said, you're violating my right to equal rights, because he wanted to ride on the white train or sit in the white rail car, and he did a test case. He made sure he got himself arrested down in New Orleans. This was done on purpose, much like Rosa Parks in 1956, was it? 55. Made sure the media was there. He got arrested. Just like Rosa Parks, make sure the media is aware of it. You get arrested, it becomes a national story. So it worked out very well. It became a national story. They got to go to a federal court, and they said, what we're going to do is we're going to have this case. Civil rights groups are going to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, and we're going to have all these segregation laws in the South overturned. Now, this video is not about whether you think segregation laws in the South are good or bad. That's really irrelevant to what I'm speaking about. But they had a bit of a shock, because at the time the Supreme Court was more conservative than today. So the Supreme Court said, well, they're not violating your rights. You still got to ride the train, didn't you? He said, well, yeah. I mean, they said, was the car you were in run down, shabby, full of rats and everything? Well, no, it was a nice car. You know, got to ride on the train, go where I wanted to go. So they said, well, they're not violating your rights. So the Supreme Court established a precedent. They said they can have separate facilities in the South or in the North if they want to have them. States can have separate facilities as long as they're equal. Of course, that depends how you look at what's equal, right? So, but anyway, they said you could have separate but equal facilities. You just can't, you can't have one train that goes 20 miles an hour and another one goes 70. One is beautiful and fixed up. The other one's a rundown piece of garbage. We're talking about the state governments. We're not talking about private businesses. States can have separate schools, they said. Okay, fine. So that the Southerners say, hooray, we can have separate racially segregated facilities. And even liberal presidents like Woodrow Wilson from Virginia was very favorable towards segregation. He was a liberal in every way except that way. He wanted to have strict segregation of the races. You don't hear that talked about much these days. But civil rights groups say, no, these guys are gonna die. So eventually they had younger people on the Supreme Court, new guys who came later. They were much more liberal. And so really in the 40s, but the most famous case is from 1954, the Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas case, where the Supreme Court reversed itself and said, no, well, forget that arbitrary rule we made up in 1896. Well, now we're going to make another arbitrary rule. We decided that segregation is unequal, and so you can't do it. Now you say to yourself, well, how could the Supreme Court just come up with these arbitrary rules? Easy, because it's based on the 14th Amendment. No state shall abridge the rights or immunities of its citizens, and they must have equal protection under the law. And the problem is that amendment is so vague. It could mean anything to anyone, right? I mean, what does this mean? It's so non-specific. And so that was used to force southern states to end, and some northern areas, but force southern states to end government segregation. Not private. That was done through the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, Civil Rights Act of 64. Okay, that deals with private business. The 14th Amendment only deals with state government. Okay, but then people said, liberal groups said, oh, well, we can use this to do all kind of social engineering. For instance, abortion. Let's look at abortion. Only a handful of states legalized abortion in the 60s and 70s, and most states were not going to legalize it, especially in the southern states, which are typically more conservative. So what does the Supreme Court say? You're violating people's privileges and immunities. And the right to have an abortion is someone's privilege and immunity. Now the conservatives say, no, it's not, because you're killing someone. You're aborting a baby. The baby's alive, so you're killing them. You're violating their rights and immunities. But you see, you had liberals on the Supreme Court, and they say, oh, well, we just arbitrarily decided that the baby doesn't have a right, but the woman does. So that's how we're going to rule on it. The 14th Amendment really just says you can just make up the law as you go. That's really what it's saying, because it's so vague. Anyone can interpret it any way they want to. You see, that's why it's like the golden ticket. It's like, remember when Charlie got the golden ticket and he could go and he sang the song, I have a golden ticket? Well, that was the liberals' golden ticket, the 14th Amendment. They knew what they wanted in 1866. That's why they were so hot to promote that. They could see this is it. This is going to set up the empire. And the Southerners, who were very scholarly too, they said, no, we know our Constitution. We studied it maybe better than you, and we're not going along with it. Well, and look at today. Now we have the homosexual marriage, like they like to say gay marriage. Okay, well, whatever you want. This is not about the merits or demerits of homosexual relationships. If you want to celebrate that, that's your beeswax. And if you want to disparage it, that's your beeswax, right? Most states did not vote to have gay marriage, homosexual unions, okay? There was no great cry for this. And in fact, one of the most liberal states, California, had an election and they rejected it. They said, no, we're not going to allow it. We're going to make it outlawed. Democracy, right? Well, forget that word democracy. The United States does not practice democracy. No, we practice empire, and it's based on the imperial rule of the 14th Amendment. We have judges that rule. Judges rule this country. You should be aware of that. So we had a series of court cases brought by left wing meaning liberal groups, and they go case by case to each state, and they have a left-wing judge say, no, you're violating people's privileges and immunities. According to our arbitrary idea, states cannot outlaw homosexual marriage. Now the Supreme Court said, they don't know what to do. They're pretty liberal, but they said, well, I'll tell you what, whatever the federal courts, lower courts wanted to do, the district courts, we'll just let that stand. Well, we know what the answer is. The district courts are going to say, you have to allow it. So it's funny, CBS News says, another state allows gay marriage. Arizona, what was the other one? One of those Western states. Well, the state did not allow gay marriage. That's twisting the news story. Very few states, only a small handful of states have allowed gay marriage. No, we have federal district judges which commanded the states to allow it. How could they command the states to allow that? Through the arbitrary rule of the 14th Amendment. No state can violate people's rights or immunities. And that's an imperial structure. You see, you have, I mean, you could think of 1,000 different social questions, right? Not just abortion or homosexuality or whatever. It could be anything. You just think of it, just whatever you want to think of. You say the state is violating, and could be a law against it. This state is violating my rights and immunities, my privileges and immunities. Get some sympathetic federal judge, and he can say, yes, through the power vested in me by the 14th Amendment, I command you. So see what we have a situation today is I command, I command. We talk about the Soviet Union and the National Socialist Germany and Iraq and Cuba and communist China. And we say, oh, we're free, not unlike those countries. Oh yes, are we free? You're free to comply. Your state is free to comply with the arbitrary rule of the US government is what your state is free to do. So what we had originally was a union of states where each state would decide its internal affairs, okay? And people like to talk about civil rights. It's a matter of civil rights. It's not a matter of civil rights. It's a matter of state power versus US power. And right now the US power is predominant because of the Enabling Act, and the Enabling Act is the 14th Amendment. This is very clear. This is simple to understand. No state can violate people's privileges or immunities. What does that mean? Who's to say? The federal courts decide. So it is an empire. It is an empire. The United States government is clearly an empire, okay? This is elementary. A child could figure this out, I think, if they studied it long enough and had a good teacher, like maybe me teaching them. But what, you know what I mean? I'm trying to tell you this. It is an empire. And not only is it a national empire where all the states have to act as satrapies or provinces of the realm. This is very clear, but it's a world empire. We know the US imposes its will on other countries. If they don't comply, you say, well, they don't have democracy. What does that mean? Well, that means they don't have a government that's in comportment with what the US demands. And then if you're a country like that, you might find yourself invaded very quickly or your government overthrown. We know this, but that's for another topic. The world empire, we know. We need to talk about the world empire, which has been actively in effect since 1898, when the US used its power to attack Spain and impose its will on the Spanish, the Kingdom of Spain. But we have the US imposing its will on the states. So when you say I live in the state of North Carolina or I live in the state of Louisiana, you don't really live in a state. It would be more accurate to say I live in the satrapy of Louisiana, or I live in the realm of Oklahoma, the imperial realm of, I live in the imperial realm of Idaho. So this is something conservatives won't talk about. You know, you have the neoconservatives, your Republican conservatives, right? They're very wary. You will never hear the Republican Party talk about the 14th Amendment. These are, you know, most of your conservatives today are very terrified people. They're very afraid. They don't want to be called racist or homophobic or whatever. You know, these are terms the left uses to intimidate people. So the heart, you say, what is the heart of the modern conservative movement, the modern Republican movement? Well, their heart value is to get elected, okay? So their main value in life, their goal in life is to have themselves in office. These are opportunists and these are careerists. Their core values are not the Constitution or freedom or peace or any of these lies that they tell the people. If they were really strong, you know, really strong conservatives like they claim, they would be out there talking about the infamy of the notorious 14th Amendment. And they would be calling for the repeal of the 14th Amendment. You know, do you expect to see a Republican up there saying, I demand that we repeal the nefarious 14th Amendment and return our country to what it was in the beginning, a union of states? No, they like to talk about some adjustment with Medicare or something like that. So, but we don't want to be defeatist, you see. So we want to have a positive message. I'm talking about we people that support the original idea of a union of states, and we know that would be much better, a union of states where each state handles its internal affairs, and the U.S. government handles the original delegated powers that it was supposed to handle. So the purpose of this video is not negativity. It's simply to clarify. And so the key question is, what shall we be in the future? An empire like today, and we know empires collapse. We can study empires. They get overextended, and they just aggravate too many people, and they collapse. Or should we be a union of states, a federation of states? And there is a union of states has the potential to last, you know, centuries and be much more successful than a scurrilous, sickening, wicked empire. So thank you for watching this video production, and I would be very appreciative to listen to your comments and talk to you about it. Thank you.